let go and let God, because there are certain things, you can beat your head against the wall for 20 years trying to do something that, or be angry about something that you have no control over, and kind of letting that go as much as possible, I think lets you have a much less stressful life.
This episode is brought to you by Bulletproof Script Coverage, where screenwriters go to get their scripts read by top Hollywood professionals. Learn more at covermyscreenplay.com. I'd like to welcome to the show the legendary Jeffrey Reddick. How you doing, Jeffrey?
I'm doing well. How you doing, brother?
I'm good, man. It's as good as we can be in this horror script of a year.
I know. It's just like when you think you hit the final act and the killer's dead, the killer pops back up again, and it's like,
I mean, like I was talking to another guest the other day about this is so on the nose. Like no studio would produce the script of 2020. It's just too. It doesn't even make sense.
It doesn't make sense. Yeah, absolutely. No, it has been like, you try to stay grateful and you try to stay positive about stuff, but you can't not take in the fact that like the world is like suffering through something really
absolutely
crazy right now.
Absolutely, and getting crazier. And getting crazier. But we as filmmakers and screenwriters are insane enough to go, yes, I know the world is burning, but how do I get my screenplay produced? I need the budget for my film.
We can still make this movie. We can do it safely.
That's the insanity of the psychosis of a filmmaker or screenwriters. It's just like, how do I get this movie made? This crazy. This is that. I imagine they're filmmakers in the Mad Max world and going, I know we have no gasoline or cameras, but we got to shoot something.
Yeah. I was thinking about starting an OnlyFans page, not doing the stuff that they normally do on there, but just me typing, just somebody. I'm sure there's some people out there that will be like, oh, that's so relaxing to watch Jeffrey type all day. Just pay me a couple of bucks a month and
you could just watch me type. Exactly. It's the new generation of the burning log or the fish tank video.
Yes.
So Jeffrey, how did you get into the business?
How I got into the business is a pretty funny story. It all started when I was 14, and I was a 14-year-old hillbilly living in Eastern Kentucky, and I saw this movie, Nightmare on Elm Street, that blew my mind. It's still my favorite movie ever. And I went home and I banged out a prequel on my little typewriter, and I found out who ran New Line Cinema, Bob Shaye, and I got the address and I mailed it to him. And he sent it back to me, and he's like, we don't take unsolicited material. Thanks for sending your thing. So I had to look up unsolicited because I'm 14. I didn't know what that meant. And then I wrote him back. I sent it back to him because I was kind of perturbed. I was like, look, sir, I've seen 3 of your movies, and I spent $3 on your work, so I think you can take 5 minutes to read my story. And he actually read it.
But this is so. What year is this? So we're talking like 80.
This was 85.
So this is the time that you could actually call up Bob Shaye's office, get a receptionist or get his assistant, and actually maybe possibly get through.
Well, I didn't get through to him on the phone, but I got.
But even get through to him. Period.
Yeah, I didn't. But then I wrote the letter, and once I wrote that second letter, he wrote me back and he's like, "Thank you for your aggressive introduction." And he read the story and he was very constructive. And basically, his assistant Joy Mann, who was a wonderful woman, she's not with us any longer. Mm-hmm. Her and Bob kind of took me under their wing from afar. So they would send me scripts and movie posters and just things that a 14-year-old kid in Kentucky like flips out over. And they stayed in touch with me till I was 19, and I went to college in Kentucky at this great college called Berea College, and I went to New York for a summer program to study acting. And Bob and Joy said, "Well, hey, do you want to intern at New Line?" I'm like, "Are you kidding me? Of course I do." And I got an agent and decided to stay in New York, and my internship turned into a position at New Line, and I ended up working there for 11 years, and they ended up producing Final Destination. So
that little thing, that little film that you. little something. I like the way you just dropped that in there. Yeah, they just produced the Final Destination. One of the more successful horror franchises in history. Now, how did you get? Well, first of all, how did you come up with the idea for Final Destination?
The kernel for the idea came when I was flying home to. A lot of stuff was is Kentucky based. I was flying home to Kentucky, and I read an article about a woman who was on vacation, and her mother called her and said, "Don't take the flight you're on tomorrow. I have a bad feeling about it." And so she changed flights, and in the story, they said the flights that she was supposed to be on crashed. So that put the idea in my head, but I didn't know the story to go with the idea. And then, years later, I was trying to get an agent for writing, and so I had to write a spec script for something that was on TV. And I love the X-Files, so I used that idea as a setup for an X-Files episode. And I got the agent, and then my friends at New Line were like, "This is a great idea. Like, don't send the script in like for an X-Files episode. Like, make it a feature." So I ended up writing a treatment, because back in the day you could sell treatments for projects,
right. Or
so
a pitch, right?
Or a pitch, yeah, you could do that back then. And now it's like, hey, pitch us the story and tell us who your A-list star is.
And do you have 50% of the financing in place already? And do you have distribution in place already?
Yeah, it's like, the business is changed so much. But one of my friends, Chris Bender, that worked at New Line, had just started working for Craig Perry and Warren Zide, who were producers that had a deal at New Line. And I knew that even though I worked at New Line and I had a straight kind of pipeline to the creative team, I knew that it would give me more juice if I had producers on board because they would just take it more seriously. But it was honestly, it was a hard sell. Like, they were like, "We don't get death being the killer. Like, you can't see it. You can't fight it." And we're like, "That's the point." And so it wasn't until we threatened to take it to Miramax, they were like, "We'll buy it." So, all right, we'll buy it and we'll take a chance on it. And,
no, it's a great great idea. It is such and you're right. I can only imagine back then, because it was like, you had Jason, you had Freddy, you had Michael Myers, you had Chucky, and all these, like, you could put that on the poster. You can't put death that has no figure on the poster. So it must have been a difficult sell for the marketing team.
It was, and I think they did a great job with it.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
But the whole reason that the whole reason that I want, and I'm glad that when James Wong and Glenn Morgan came on, they fought to make sure that death never had a form, and they came up with some other amazing thing, like the whole Rube Goldberg aspect of it. But the reason that I wanted to not give death a form is because I wanted it to be as universal as possible. And if you put like a Western kind of Christian version of death, like Grim Reaper with sickle or something like that, then it doesn't appeal to people who either have different religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs, or don't have spiritual beliefs. So I thought it was very important to not do that. And I think that's why it's been as successful as it has been. Yeah,
it travels very well around the world because everybody has death in their culture. That is something, that concept is in every culture. The figure of it is different from culture to culture.
Right.
But that's it.
They can project their own version of what death is onto the movie,
which is fantastic. And I remember the trailers of that film. They just and as the sequels kept coming, they kept focusing more and more on the deaths. Like that was the selling point. Like, what is the craziest way we could kill somebody?
Yes.
and that became the hook, I guess, as these kept going. How many? There was 5, right?
Yeah, there have been 5 of them, and there will be a 6th one. It was definitely in the works before COVID hit, and now COVID's just kind of put the brakes. Are they
going to kind of reboot the whole thing, or are they going to just make it a straight up sequel? Or you don't know, you can't tell.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if reboot. I think reboot is too strong of a word. Because it's the Final Destination. Films have their formula. A big set piece at the beginning, and then death comes after people. So I don't know if reboot's the right word because that intimates.
But bring a new generation, I guess. I mean, but every cast was like, you didn't have one cast member that ran through the whole thing, did you? I don't remember.
Tony Todd is the recurring has been the recurring character, and Ali Larter was in the first and second one. Yeah, Tony Todd's been he hasn't been in every single one of them, but he's been in like
a lot of
he should be in every one of them. But,
right.
There were a few where they didn't put him in there, and they got the message that people love Tony Todd and Final Destination.
Now, I do remember you and I originally met 10 years ago on a panel here in LA, a horror film panel. And I remember you saying on the panel, they're like, look, they can make as many of these as they want because every single time they make one, I get a check. So
Yeah, I know.
Residuals. No,
Yeah,
but
that sounds like
good.
yeah, yeah. That sounds better on a panel. When there aren't many people there. Then I sound like a douchebag.
No, but no, and I don't
but
mean
it
to
is-
make. I don't mean to make you sound like that. I completely, and I
No,
mean
I'm
that. And
totally kidding.
listen, I know a lot of. I've had a lot of screenwriters on board that like they work on a few of the first ones, and then I had the guy who did Air Bud, who created Air Bud,
Oh, yeah.
and they'd made 12 of those films. He was only involved in the first 2 or 3, but every single time they make a new one, he gets a residual check. So that's nothing to be ashamed of as a screenwriter.
Well, I know even as a horror fan though, it's like I want there to, yes, the money is nice, but I want there to be more because I can't think of any other franchise that's been this successful and they've only made 5 of them in 20 years. Like every other,
true.
there have been like 20 Halloweens and 20 Friday, there have been like, even Nightmare on Elm Street, there's been like, it's like, come on, make some more because the fans want it and I need to get some new shoes.
As we were saying, residual checks are nice. They're very, very nice. Now, I always like to ask this of a screenwriter who has a hit, because when Final Destination came out, it was a fairly large hit for the budget. It was a fairly small budget too. It wasn't a huge budget.
No, that one I have to say that it was 20 million, which is actually
big for a horror movie back then.
Big for a horror film. But yeah, it was a big hit. It was a sleeper hit. It opened at like number 3 or 4, and then the next week it went up, and then the next week it went up to number 1. So it was definitely a word of mouth hit too, which was nice to see happen.
And that rarely ever happens,
especially with horror. Yeah, usually they open big and then they drop.
Right, exactly. Quickly. So I always like to ask screenwriters who had that kind of success, how did the town treat you? What was the experience of being in the Final Destination hurricane, if you will?
Well, the funny thing is I missed the hurricane because I was in New York. So I worked out of the New York office of New Line. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't in LA where kind of all the, the hurricane-like action happens. So I was aware of how well it did, but I was in a different world. Mm-hmm. And so I stayed at New Line because I just love the company so much. I'm just one of those people that, creatures of habit that gets very comfortable. I actually stayed at New Line until I sold the story for the sequel in 2000. And then finally my bosses were like, and everybody at New Line was like, we love you to death, Jeffrey, but you sold 2 movies now. It's time to move. Do it for real.
Go out into the world, Jeffrey. It's okay. Like they were pushing you out of the nest.
Out of the nest. And but I was happy in New York, so I was going to stay in New York, but unfortunately, 9/11 happened, and I lived in Battery Park City, which is not far from the World Trade Center. So Once that happened, I decided to move out to LA. So, typically when something like that happens, even when you sell a project, you kind of, looking back, you kind of, you move to LA immediately, you milk that movie as much as you can till it comes out, and if it's a hit, you're out here. But I kind of missed all of that stuff. So by the time I got out here, it was funny because my agent, I got an agent, and he pretty much had to introduce me to the town because, James Wong and Lynn Morgan, who, co-wrote the movie and also directed it, they were out here in the hurricane. Mm-hmm. So people didn't really know who I was until I actually got out here. And then they read my script and they're like, oh, I'm like, well, my name's all over the poster. But they don't, it's a town where if you're not sitting in a room with somebody, they don't actually go and look at a movie poster in the credits. Like, they just kind of go.
Yeah, out of sight, out of mind, basically.
Out of sight, out of mind. So I missed the craziness of the hurricane, which I think was probably a good thing for me just as a person, because I think if I had got out here, I may have got sucked into like just a world of craziness that I wasn't prepared for. I got sober like 15 years ago. So I think if, and mine was, my vice was drinking, and it was, just wasn't anything like super crazy. It was just kind of more like sitting at home being a sad drunk and not being happy. So I think if I'd have been out here in that celebratory party kind of scene,
it wouldn't have been healthy.
I think it would have been very unhealthy for me. So I think it was probably, God looking out for me in that way. But it's funny now, kind of, as the years go by, though, seeing how much of an impact the movie has had. Like, when I hear somebody say this is a Final Destination moment, like, even when I'm not around, like, they don't know that I'm involved with it at all. I'll just be out in public and somebody's like, oh, it's like Final Destination. And it's like, holy shit, like, this is like part of the culture now. Like,
it's in the zeitgeist of it's definitely transcended. Like, I mean, I'd argue kind of like a Freddy or a Jason or a Chucky or a Michael, but in its own very unique space. I mean, you have a Final Destination is a very unique niche within the horror genre because there is no killer.
Yeah.
It's visual killer. It's a very, a very, very unique, and that has more than one movie. It has 5 movies, so that it's in itself. And I guess they kept being successful because they kept making them.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and it's, it's just as somebody who's been a horror fan my whole life, it's been very gratifying, but it's also a dragon that you're chasing. You find yourself chasing that dragon where somebody's like, well, why don't you bring us something like Final Destination again? And I'm like, well, here's this idea. And they're like, oh, that's too much like Final Destination. Well, that was not enough like Final Destination.
So that is something that's real because a lot of filmmakers and screenwriters don't realize that. But when you're a hit in town for something, that's the box you get put into, and you a lot of times have to fight your way out of that box. I know for a fact that Wes Craven, one of the greatest horror directors of all time, I knew his personal assistant. He was his personal assistant for many years, and he was dying to get out of. He wanted to do something different. He'd been doing horror for such a long time. And that movie, Music of the Heart, which was called 500 Violins, the only reason he got that was because they wanted Scream 2. He's like, well, if you want me to do Scream 2, Harvey, give me the budget to make this. And that's how he got it. But I felt that he was, from what I understood, he was frustrated that he was only able to do horror. I know he wanted to venture out as an artist. And that happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, since I love horror, I don't mind being in that box as far as writing goes. But yeah, the idea that it's like we need you to bring us something like
Final Destination,
that unique thing that you created, but then we were very concerned about it because it was unique until it became a hit. It's just a hard place to be in. But the good thing is I find myself like branching out a little bit. Like right now, I'm working on 2 animated series for Netflix. Mm-hmm. And they're kid animated series. And one of them has some creepy dark fairy tale elements, and the other one's like a spinoff of Usagi Yojimbo, the Japanese comic book. Sure. So that's like samurai rabbits, and it's so much fun to do it. So I'm finding myself finally branching out a little bit, but I always will come back to genre. Like I love the genre so much that.
Well, if you love it, you love it. But you also want to break out from. Look, I don't want to write another Final Destination. I did that. Let's move on.
Yeah, let's do something else.
Now, were you involved with the sequels? I know you were involved with the second sequel. Were you involved with the other sequels at all?
Not physically involved. I mean, I'm very good friends with the producer, Craig Perry. So he'll call me up and a lot of times and bounce ideas off of me and let me know what's going on. So I definitely kind of know what's going on with the franchise, and it's actually been fun to see other people kind of come in and put their mark on the brand. I mean, the first one, it's always been this almost incestuous circle with the first 4. It's like, I worked on the first one and the second one. James Wong and Glenn Morgan worked on the first one and the third one. Eric Bress and J. Mecca Gruber worked on the second one, and then Eric Bress did the fourth one, and then we brought in somebody new for the fifth one. And it was, I love the fifth one. But it's just fun to see like other people kind of come in and take that concept and put their spin on it.
Right. I'm imagining what George Lucas feels like with what they've been doing with Mandalorian and all the other cool films and stuff that they're doing with his baby that he had put out so many years ago.
Yeah.
Huh?
I think it all depends probably on personalities. Like if I'm not sure, like, because I know some people get very protective and precious of their work, but I think that's part of working at a studio that helped me kind of separate my ego from a lot of that stuff, because I realize, like, once you write a movie and somebody else buys it, you're kind of handing it over to other people. So you just hope to create a good enough relationship with those people that you can have some say in how they execute it. But again, it's a quality problem to have if you have other people doing sequels to your stuff. So I definitely don't complain about.
Right. So first world problems, as they say. It's first world problems. Now, you are such a fan and a student of the genre of horror films. What makes a good horror screenplay?
I mean, I think for me, it starts with the basics of, having relatable characters. I think if you make me fall in love with these characters and care about them, then I will follow the journey wherever it takes me. Sometimes scripts go off into bizarre directions, but if it's grounded in characters that I can really relate to and care about, that's always the most important thing for me. I do think, for horror, you want to have some kind of hook that can bring people into the story, some kind of concept that doesn't feel like we're reading the same story of, a family moves into a house and, something horrible happened there and now a ghost is like haunting them. It's like we've seen that so many times. It's like you do want something that we haven't seen 100 times, unless you're putting a very unique spin on it. Scares and suspense are obviously important. And if you're doing a straight up horror film, obviously the kills and the set pieces are important too. If you're doing a movie, because you're writing something for people, but you're making it for an audience out there. So there are certain things that the audience expects in a horror film. So you either want to deliver on those expectations or subvert them in a cool way. So
very cool. Now, what are the biggest problems you see with horror protagonists? Because, it's almost a cliche. You're like, why are you doing, like, you're yelling at the screen, don't go in there. The killer's in there. What is the biggest problem you see with protagonists in horror films in general?
I think that you pretty much hit it on the head. I mean, I think a lot of movies require, and I'm sure like there are movies that I've written where this happens too, but when you require, because the thing is, audiences, I read this somewhere where a psychologist said that film audiences always think that they're braver and smarter than the people on screen. So like, when a character wouldn't do something in the film, the audience are like, well, if I was there, I'd have jumped on that killer's back and done it. But the worst thing you can do is have like, and I've seen so many good movies just get undermined by this, where they just have the main characters stay in a location when any rational person would have left, and do stupid things that any rational person wouldn't do. So if you have a character that keeps making bad choices just to keep the story going, that's the biggest mistake I see. I've read so many scripts where it's like, this isn't even movie talking. This is like a human being. Like, I cannot think of any person, no matter how tough they are, that would stay here after what they just saw.
Right.
I read a script recently where, a person gets invited to like some mysterious party and doesn't know who invited them, and walks in and there's like some weird orgy going on. And, she backs up into some strange guy and he's like, oh, don't worry about that. Follow me. I'll show you where the host is. And I'm like, person would be gone at that point. She was horrified by the orgy. It wasn't like she saw the orgy and was like, that looks fun. She was like horrified by it. And so who's going to follow some strange man, So when I read stuff like that in scripts, especially when it happens over and over again, I think that's the biggest mistake I see in horror films, is making your characters continually do silly things just to keep the story going.
Well, when I was thinking of three films specifically that are horror films that are so good that they transcend the genre almost, which is Jaws, Exorcist, and Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
The stories, the characters, everything is so well constructed. There's never a moment in Silence of the Lambs I'm just like, don't like, why are you doing that? Like Jaws is perfectly, it's as perfect of a film, it's period, as you can get. And The Exorcist, like the situation is structured in a way where, well, the priest is trying to get the devil out of this girl, so he has to be in there because that's his job, as opposed to, let's all split up in the woods.
Yeah.
So the killer can knock us off one at a time.
Right. And you don't get a pass, because I see a lot of this in the scripts too, where people will be like, really? Now you want to split up now? Have you seen a horror movie? And then they still split up. It's like, that doesn't give you a pass by acknowledging.
Exactly. Now, well, and that was the perfect thing. Well, that started with Scream, when Scream actually was so self-aware of its own faults.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a brilliant script, and that's
I love Scream. That's one of my favorites.
I mean, it's so brilliantly done, and the first opening sequence with Drew Barrymore. I mean, it's the Psycho. You're killing it. Yeah, I mean, spoiler alert: first 10 minutes, Drew dies. But it was shocking for a new generation. It was basically what Psycho did back in the day. But it was so brilliant. I remember when that came out, it was just like a revelation. Like everybody, it was such a monster hit at the time.
Well, it's funny because I went to a screening of it and I saw the poster in the trailer. I thought Drew Barrymore was the star of it. So I just went in there with my sweet ass going, well, I can't wait to watch Drew scream for like 90 minutes and I was like, what? What?
What's going on?
It's like one of the most brilliant 10 minutes of cinema.
Yeah, it's amazing. Now, we know what the problem is with protagonists, but what can you do as a screenwriter to make a horror villain legendary? Because we've already rattled off a handful of names that are, all you need to do is just say their first names, and in the horror genre, they know what it is. So what do you do? Like, what makes Michael Myers, Freddy, Jason, those characters so legendary, as opposed to other horror either franchises that either come and go, that have those kind of, it looks from the poster the same elements as Jason or Freddy, but they don't live up to it, and they don't. What's that magic? What's that thing, in your opinion?
You know what? I think I don't think that there's. I don't think that's almost an answer, because it's almost like catching lightning in a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes the characters are so, like you mentioned, Silence of the Lamb, like Hannibal Lecter is such a delectable, like, with just the portrayal and the way that he was filmed and everything was that it's mesmerizing. So sometimes you have villains like that, or Freddy Krueger, I think, is probably the best example of the slashers, because especially in the first movie, like, he was so feral, and so there was just something so wicked about him. Like, he cut himself, he cut at people, he was just horrible. Like, we'd never seen anything like that. And Chucky too had such a distinct, it's a toy, it's like, it looked like a little toy. You almost had as much fun with Chucky movies when the doll's getting knocked around, knowing that it's possessed. Like, so there's something about that. But, I think, with Michael Myers, he didn't say anything, and it was just, he was this embodiment of evil. But also that movie came out at a time, we were kind of in, the suburbs. Everything was about the suburbs and how the suburbs were safe and the last bastion of safety in America. And, Michael Myers came in and kind of took that over. And with Friday the 13th, like, people forget, Jason's mother was a killer in the first one, and he wore like a sack over his head in the second one. He didn't get the hockey mask on the third one. And I think that by that point, where our culture was at the time, slashers are so hot. And that just happened to be the one that, like, exploded. Friday the 13th exploded. I don't know if it was necessarily because of Jason per se.
Timing. It was timing.
I think it was timing on that one. Because, again, most people think of him with a hockey mask. And it's like, well, he didn't have the hockey mask till the third movie. And he wasn't the killer in the first one. So I think timing has a lot to do with when certain movies take off and when certain movies hit. But I think...
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but I think when you create a villain for a horror film, especially if it's like a slasher film, you do kind of want to come up with some kind of iconography, some kind of look that's unique, where people like they'll remember that killer if your movie's fortunate enough to, like, really strike a chord with people and take off. Like, that sucks about Final Destination. It's like, we could have had a Halloween costume and a toy line, but we don't, because we don't have a killer. So.
But we have 5 movies and hopefully a 6th coming.
I love the movies, but it's funny because it's like, because I love, like, collecting, like, movie posters and statues and tchotchkes. So it'd be nice to. It's like, can't have one for mine, but that's all right.
They should actually sell the statues of the kills. So, like the sequence of a kill, like that
would be awesome. Like the log going in the sheriff's car.
Right. Exactly. All those kills.
On the balance beam in the 5th one. Like, I love that kill too.
Yeah, but you look at things like Leprechaun And I'm like, how did that become a thing? Like they ran off. Like how many of those are there? They just took off. So, and then something like Candyman didn't. Like there should be 20 Candyman.
Yeah, there should be. I mean, well, you know what's interesting too is we have to also look at the time when these movies came out as far as what was accessible. Mm-hmm. So, you know, back when I was young, you know, there were like 3 networks and HBO. So everybody was watching the same things. And so people were seeing the same movies. There weren't as many movies that were coming out as there are now. So, you know, you didn't have when scary movies came out, like everybody rushed to see them, but everybody across the country was seeing like the same movies and watching the same things on television. You know, like back in the day, it was like 60 million, you know, viewers was like a hit for a network show. And now it's like, well, we got 10 million viewers. It's a hit. So, you know, the country used to be much more, the choices used to be a lot more limited. So a lot of the people would get around, especially the horror fans with reading Fangoria. You know, you'd see what was coming up in Fangoria, and then all the horror fans would rush out and see those movies. And they're cheaper to make and they turn a profit. So I think that's why you have a lot of horror franchises. You know, they seem to have burned themselves out a while ago, just because I think the marketplaces got bigger with like the streamers, and so many theater chains now with so many movies coming out. Like you really have to like rise above all the clutter out there.
Right. And like Candyman's I think it's in the can already, the Jordan Peele remake of Candyman. Yeah, it was
going to come out, but they had to push it. But, you know, Candyman's one of those movies. I mean, it definitely appears in like the top rated, you know, as far as it's a beautiful movie. But I do think, you know, I like to say it delicately because people get their hackles up when you start talking about race at all. Mm-hmm. But, you know, you have to look at the time when that movie came out.
Right.
And, you know, it's basically an interracial love story. And, you know, people weren't quite ready for that. I mean, I just read in 85, you know, there was when they put out Commando, there was a love scene between Arnold Schwarzenegger's character and the female lead. But when they cast Ray Dong Chong, they cut this love scene out because they're like, the country's not ready for this yet. And there was still a lot of that, I think, ickiness that people had about interracial relationships. And I'm like, screw you, because if it wasn't for interracial relationships, I wouldn't be here. So
right. Exactly.
But you know, it was a different time back then. So that movie's, from the acting, directing.
Yeah, I remember it.
Shots, I mean, everything is like, it's a masterful movie. Like such a beautiful movie. And I thought the sequel was good too. I like the sequel a lot. But yeah, it did. I think the reason it probably didn't take off is it wasn't the, you know, hot teenagers getting slashed up. You know, it was like dealing with like, you know, racial inequality and racial injustice. And it also had an interracial love story at the center of it. So I think people, you know, I just think people weren't quite ready for that at the time that it came out.
So how do you see from the moment that Final Destination was released to now and moving forward, how has horror changed? Because I don't see as many slasher films anymore. That's not as in vogue as it used to be.
Right.
You know, it's not like the 80s, the golden era of slasher films and that kind of horror. What kind? And then there was the was it horror porn, or not horror porn, but Saw. Yeah, torture porn. Yeah, the Saw and the Hostel and that whole era of kind of horror. Where do you see horror going? And are we going to come back to some of this, you know, nostalgic slasher? Because I know they tried to remake Freddy and they did as good of a job, but you can't catch that. Robert Englund is Freddy.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think right now we're very much in a supernatural kind of,
right.
You know,
Conjuring
kind of horror kind of world. But I honestly, you know, because I know that the business tries to stay ahead of the curve and kind of run the ball about what's going to be popular. But then something popular comes out, and then everybody tries to start making that. So everybody's, you know, trying to make the next Get Out now, like socially relevant kind of horror films. So I think we'll be seeing some more of that coming out for a while. But I think we're just one, you know, fresh slasher film away from having any of these genres come back. I mean, I still love a good slasher movie. You know, there have been a glut of zombie movies, like, and I get on Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu and everything. I'm like, from every country, it's like there's a gazillion zombie movies out there right now.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I think people go to see horror films to escape the horrors going on in the real world. So I feel like escapism horror, like supernatural kind of stuff, is probably going to always be popular. And slasher stuff, because that's still escapism if it's not sadistic, like just mean spirited.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly know when COVID first hit, all my friends were like, we're writing a COVID script. I'm like, don't.
No. I said the same thing. I'm like, I talked to some executives like, we got 20 COVID scripts a day and nobody is going to produce a COVID script, because the last thing I want to watch is a COVID script.
Yeah.
Like, you didn't want to watch a 9/11 movie after 9/11 or a Vietnam movie while Vietnam was going on.
Yeah. So I think that I think the escapism horror, I think supernatural still goes strong for a long time, but I think slasher movies are always going to be popular. It's just you gotta get that right slasher kind of combination with characters and the slasher together.
And that's the one thing I love. You said something a second ago, mean spirited. With those slasher films of the 80s that we all kind of love and grew up with, they're not mean spirited. I mean, Freddy is funny. Like, he got funnier. He got a lot funnier after the second and third and fourth. He became almost a comedy act, killing people towards the end of that series. And it wasn't mean spirited. Even Michael and Jason, who are kind of basically voiceless, they don't say anything. And when Freddy versus Jason came out, I mean, that was hilarious. That was so much fun. But that is a key, isn't it? Not being mean spirited in the way you do it. And I think a lot of those torture porn films, I think a little bit were a little bit mean spirited. Like Saw 1 was amazing.
Yeah. And I think that's it's all it's a matter of taste for sure. Like, I don't, because I know certain people like certain types of movies, but I think that there's a difference. Like, and I'll just use Hostel as an example. Like, I thought the first Hostel was very entertaining. Like, it had humor to it. You had, male antagonists for the first time in a long time in horror movies. So, and it was also kind of commenting on how, like, American anybody will travel internationally, and we have an arrogance about us. Like, we go to like France and we're like annoyed that people don't speak English. But we're here demanding that everybody speak English. But when we travel, we're like, why doesn't anybody speak English everywhere? So it kind of played up that whole thing and made the characters were kind of, some of them were sympathetic, but some of them were kind of jerks. And the torture didn't come till later. Whereas I think if you watch Saw 2, in my humble opinion, like it kind of did everything right that Hostel did. I think Hostel 2 did wrong, because it had, women, it had the, Heather Mazzazoa's character who's like tied up naked, hung upside down, like begging for her life as this woman like slowly like slices her for, it's just, there's a difference in tone. Like there's just a mean spiritedness about like Hostel 2, and there's a mean spiritedness about certain of these kind of torture porn movies where you're not just, because you want to go have fun at these movies. It's not like,
right.
It's not like watching you don't want to go and watch somebody, you don't want to watch a mortician dissect a body.
Correct.
In real life. So for a horror movie, it's not like you want to sit there and watch a killer slowly like torture a person to death. It's like watching somebody torture a cat on, online. It's like, that's not entertaining. That's just feels gratuitous and is mean spirited. And I think that's why those films don't tend to have as big of an audience. Because even the Saw movies, they're not. I don't feel like they're mean spirited. There's a sense of like with Jigsaw, giving people a choice to like save themselves or save somebody else. Sometimes I don't feel like they're gruesome, but I don't feel like they're mean. Like it feels like you're like.
I remember Hostel being like Hostel 2 specifically was. I agree with you. Was mean. Yeah, like there was just like, I don't want to watch this. Like this is. Yeah. Then you watch Freddy, and you're like, well, this is fun. Like this is just fun. Chucky is,
fun.
Like when my wife saw Chucky the first time, she's like, and she watched it years later after it was released. She's like, this is ridiculous. I would just kick the damn thing. It's a doll. Like it's a doll. What's wrong with you people? Like it's like, but that's kind of what makes it funny, and that he's so wonderfully written, and his dialogue and everything is so and the Bride of Chucky and all of that stuff. It's amazing. Now, what do you feel? Because you've, I'm sure, read a lot of scripts in your day. What is the biggest mistake you see young screenwriters make?
I don't know if this is a quantitative, like if this is a literal mistake. I can say I think the problem that I find with a lot of young screenwriters is they think they're great writers with their first script
right away. Yeah.
And any just if you think logically, no matter what you're an artist, whether you're a painter, a writer, singer, you get better with practice and the more you do it. And if you're a craftsman, if you make stuff out of wood, you get better. Like the first thing that you carve out of wood isn't going to be the best thing that's ever been carved out of wood before. So I think the biggest mistake that I see with a lot of young writers is they kind of come out with this attitude like, I understand that you have to believe in yourself, because trust me, this business is like, you get rejected, 1,000 times and then you get one person saying yes. So you have to keep your ego, you have to keep your spirits up and your ego right sized. But I just see a lot of young writers where they're like, this is the best script, I've ever written, and you got to read it. And then if you read it and you start giving them notes, they start arguing with you. And, not that I think that my notes are the end all be all, but it's like, there's an unwillingness to recognize that they're young. Like, trust me, my first couple of scripts, I went back and read them. I'm like, wow, these are, years later, I'm like, these are crap. These were awful. I can't believe I thought these were great. But I think the biggest mistake young writers make is they don't understand that, you've got to keep doing it to get better. And, every script that I write hopefully is better than the last script that I wrote, because I've learned something in between. So I think being open to that process and realizing it takes time. Like there's a lot of people that think there's some easy shortcut. Like, and I'm sure you've heard this too. Every time, I speak at any place, whether it's a high school or a college or a horror convention or a screenwriting convention, the two questions that people ask me are, how do I get my script to a studio head? And how do I get financing?
How do I get an agent? Yeah.
And how do, and it's like, there aren't any people think that there are, like, it literally, like, I heard there was a 10-year rule. Somebody, and I can't remember who it was, I wish I could. Somebody very smart and famous at the time had said, if you're an artist, you have to be willing to dedicate 10 years of your life to struggling before you finally succeed. And they said, and when we say succeed, we don't mean that you're going to all of a sudden be rich and, have all the money in the world. We mean to get something done. And, I thought that rule was bull when I went to, New York. As I was 19, I got an agent. I was interning at New Line. I was like, screw that 10-year rule. It was 10 years to the year I graduated high school that I sold Final Destination. So it took all that time of me writing scripts, getting them rejected, almost getting jobs, not getting them. It took 10 years to actually get my first project produced and made from when I graduated. So people have, I think that's a rule that people need to keep in the back of their head, because there's so much clutter in the business where you have people who are like, all right, I'm going to try this acting thing for 2 years because my dad has a lot of money and I'm pretty or handsome. And if I don't make it, I'm going to quit. So you have people who are dedicating their lives to this. Plus you have all this clutter of hundreds of people coming to Hollywood every day, with rich families, and they were the best looking person at their school, so they've got to be the most beautiful, and so you have to it's almost like Survivor. You have to outlast.
What is it? Outthink, outlast, out.
Yeah, it's like you've got to be in it for the long haul. This isn't a business, that can be kind of a side hobby. No. It's something you really have to jump into the pool, and you have to swim in that pool for up to maybe 10 years. So there aren't any shortcuts, because it's even the stuff when I wrote that letter to Bob Shaye, I didn't have any grand plan about, this is going to lead to this and this and this in the future. I was just I have a story I want to tell, and I want this. He does the Freddy movies, and I want him to read it. That was my only goal, because I had a story to tell that I wanted somebody to read. So I could never have planned that, oh, he's going to kind of take me under his wing and then I'm going to get it. Yeah, I never planned any of that stuff. So I found that what people call like luck has often been years of me working really hard over here and it not paying off like I thought it would. But then somebody else on this side of this side of town reads a script and they're like, oh, let's call Jeffrey. So there's been a lot of that. So all the work that you put out there will benefit you somehow, but you just don't always know how it's going to be. So you can't expect like a shortcut, like somebody at a convention is going to, have their agent sign you, and then all of a sudden you're going to sell your script, and then that's it. It's just.
There is no shortcut. I completely agree with you. And we both got shrapnel, lots of it in our business, lots of shrapnel,
lots of wounds.
Yeah. Lots of wounds. And when you say put work out there, when I with this podcast, I've been, that's why a lot of podcasts fail, is because they just like, I'm going to do 20. I'm just going to do like after 20, they're like, well, no one's listening. I'm not making any money. I got to go. And I've outlasted almost all of my contemporaries. And by putting out these episodes, it's amazing who listens to this stuff.
Yes.
And all of a sudden I get a phone call or I get an email going, hey, I listened to this one obscure episode, and this guy who directed some of the biggest movies ever wants to be on your show because it'd be a good fit for what he's doing right now. I'm like, what? Like, how is that? But that's the thing. It's putting work out there without any attachment to the outcome, I think the biggest piece of advice.
Absolutely.
Now, can you tell me about how you've transitioned from just being a lowly screenwriter to now being a writer-director of a new film?
Well, yeah, it's so funny because, in features, yes, the writers are like
lowly. In TV, not so much, but yes.
TV, yeah. started working in TV recently. I'm like, I've been missing out on the party. Like, the good stuff is in TV. Oh my God. But it's funny. Like, I had a couple projects that I said I have to direct these because if I give them away, I already know how people are going to change them, and these are things I want to direct. And when I first went out with Good Samaritan, I just went out with it as a project. I didn't go out with the idea of me directing. But the thing with this story is, you're not sure if it's a supernatural force that's after them, or if it's a killer that's after them, or if it's all in the main character's head because she's had some trauma in her past. And every place that wanted to do the movie was like, just make it straight up supernatural, or just make it a straight up killer, and then we'll do it. And I'm like, but that's not the story I want to tell. Like, that's kind of the easy story to tell. Like, I want to tell something a little different. So I realized that if I wanted to do this movie the way that I wrote it, then I would have to direct it myself. And I'd been on enough sets and have been in the business long enough that I knew the basics. And I directed a short in a like an indie music video for a friend. So I knew the basics, but you definitely don't know what you don't know until you actually get on a set and start directing yourself. So that was some hubris on my part, thinking, well, I've been on a lot of sets and I did a short, so I'm ready.
That's awesome.
But I have to say, it was like such, now that we're done, it was such a fulfilling experience, and it was such a learning experience too, because now I know the areas that I need to fill in that I didn't know before. So I'm excited to do it. I'm glad that I did it. It was, again, and my director friends were like, well, trust me, when you direct your first feature, you'll either be like, screw that, I'm never directing again, or you'll want to do it again. So I definitely want to do it again. But yeah, the reason for me doing it was out of necessity of not wanting them to change, the story into like just a straight up supernatural movie or straight up, slasher movie. And it's, like this definitely didn't have anywhere near the budget of Final Destination, but like Final Destination, it was a concept where the people that wanted to do it were like, well, it's not horror supernatural enough to sell it as a horror movie. And if we sell this as a thriller, then you need A-list stars. So we have to get A-list stars attached. So there, all that business kind of crap that came up with, even with Final Destination, where people they're like, oh, you can't do something that's not easily put in a box. Just kind of motivated me to like do it myself.
Yeah, because you were trying to go down the road with the film like traditionally, like go to the studios, try to get financing, do it a little bit, do it the normal way. But you kept getting so much stuff, so much resistance on your vision. You're like, well, screw it. Let's just go do it indie.
Yeah. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about, first of all, the name of the movie, what the name of the movie is, and what is it about?
Oh, yeah. The movie is called Don't Look Back. It was originally titled Good Samaritan, so people might get confused about that, but it's called Don't Look Back. And it's about a group of people who see somebody getting fatally assaulted in a park, and they don't help. And one of the people I helped, and the video goes public. The victim's brother outs the witnesses, and somebody or something starts killing them. So our lead character is a woman named Caitlin who's gone through some trauma in her past, and she's convinced that something supernatural is after them. So she's trying to solve the mystery of who killed the guy in the park. And everybody else is like, there's a killer after us. And then she kind of ends up popping up at a lot of the scenes where the dead people are, because she's kind of seeing these supernatural signs around her that are pointing her in a direction of it's supernatural, but you're not sure if it's in her head or not. So, yeah, that was a bad elevator pitch because I kind of jumped around a little bit.
I'm going to have to pass on this one. I can't finance this one, Jeffrey. I'm sorry.
Yes. Sorry, dude. That was like 5-6 sentences. And yeah. But yeah, it was a really fun film to make. And, again, what was great for me too is I just had a lot of creative control. Like, again, there were definitely areas like with locations and things like that where we had to, compromise because we didn't have a budget to do certain things. But, I got to work with a wonderful cast. Our lead, Courtney Bell, is a wonderfully talented Black actress. And, I got to find the best actress for the film who was, a Black actress, which, if I'd done this with a studio, the people that they were throwing at me were not. They were like, that's always that's been important for me for so long, because I've written diverse casts in my films before, and they always end up being cast with all white actors and actresses. And I just try to explain to people, because again, people, when you talk about diversity, it's again like certain, hackles start raising because people start getting like defensive. But it's more about, when people read scripts in Hollywood or they cast movies, their default for every character is a white actor or actress. So that's just the default for a leading, like, we'll send out a casting notice for leading ladies or leading men, and we'll say, all ethnicities, and 99% of the submissions will be white actors and actresses. And even if we send out, notes saying we're looking for Black actors and actresses, they'll send us a lot then, but then, they're still throwing in more white people at us, being like, look at these people first. So for certain roles, people of color are just not in people's brains, even the casting people's brains, right, when it comes to leading roles. And so we're starting to course correct that now, but it is frustrating when they cast like, white actors and actresses in roles that were written for people of color. And they always say, well, we just went with the best person. But I've seen I've been in the rooms with people casting projects, and their thinking is what is going to be the most palpable to people across the United States and across the world. And that's why they make that decision most of the time. So now we're seeing that course corrected a little bit. And I've just seen so many wonderfully gifted, lead talented actors and actors of every race, white, Latino, Asian, Black. There's so many talented people that just giving people an opportunity that, like Courtney would not have been cast as a lead in a horror film if it was done by a studio. But I think when people see her performance now, they're going to be like, holy shit, who is this girl? So I'm really excited about that.
Well, I'm looking forward for it to get released, and I will put links to all of that in the show notes. I'm going to now ask you a few questions I ask all of my guests. Oh. What are 3 horror screenplays every screenwriter should read?
Well, I am going to say A Nightmare on Elm Street. I think that's a really, really strong script. I think because I consider Aliens horror sci-fi-ish.
It dances the line of horror. I get you. I get exactly where you're coming from. There's a monster. A Predator arguably is a monster film. I mean, if you think of monsters of the Frankenstein and Dracula of our generation is Aliens and Predators. Yeah. But they dance the line between action, sci-fi, horror. But yes, Aliens is just an amazing film, period.
And it's such a great script, and that's a script where you can tell a director wrote the script, because when you visualize the movie, you visualize exactly what ended up on the screen. So that's how James wrote that script. But that's probably not a good rule, because I always tell screenwriters not to direct in their scripts.
But the Alien script also was terrifying.
Yeah,
the original Alien was terrifying as well.
And what's another great script? I feel like I'm cheating, because it's just like I just think of Silence of the Lambs too. Like that was another script that I read that, I'm trying to think if there's obscure horror scripts. Like, the Scream script is really fun.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Dialogue.
Exorcist obviously is a screenplay. Jaws, I'm not sure if the screenplay is as powerful as the film. I haven't read the Jaws screenplay. Have you read the Jaws screenplay?
No. Mm-mm.
Yeah, I don't know if that translates, but I think The Exorcist, if I remember correctly, reading that script, it was pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
Okay. What advice would you give a screenwriter wanting to break into the business today?
Write a lot. Reading scripts online. I think finding a genre that you're passionate about is very important, because the business does tend to pigeonhole you or put you in a box based off your first kind of hit. Mm-hmm. So I think, if you like horror, if you like sci-fi, if you like action, find some of your favorite movies in that genre and find the scripts online, because reading scripts will give you a lot of inspiration and even instruction on how to write stuff. So I think that's really important. And I tell people too, it's like, we live in an age now where people can shoot movies, like 4K movies, on their iPhone. And, the reason you write a script is because you want to get it made. And if you're a young screenwriter, especially, surround yourself with good creative people. Like, find a good friend of yours who's a director. Especially if you're in like school studying screenwriting. Like I was talking to Craig Perry at UCLA to like their screenwriting class, and Craig asked the class, screenwriters, raise your hands, directors, raise your hands. And he's like, how many of you all hang out together? And none of them did. And Craig's like, guys, you're crazy. Like, you're a writer. You should be directors. You should be hanging out with the writers, because you need scripts to write. And so I think people don't think that way when you're younger. It's like you think a little bit more myopically. And I think if you think about that, connecting yourself with a good director, writing a really amazing short, and having a director direct it can get you a lot of attention. I think that those are the things. Like it's continue making sure that you keep growing as an artist. Like, have friends who will give you honest feedback. You'll find out your friends pretty quickly. You'll have the friends that hate everything you do. Like, you don't need those friends to give, because they just hate it. They're going to hate everything you do. Mm-hmm. And you don't want your mom reading your script, because she's going to love everything you write. But you'll find that right balance of people who give you constructive criticism. And it's just be open to that too. Be open to learning more, because you're always going to grow as an artist.
And what is the lesson that took you the longest to learn, whether in the film business or in life?
What if I haven't learned it completely? Trying to control things that I have no control over is the lesson in life that I still also struggle with. I still try. I try not to, but I think it's a very important lesson, is to let go and let God, because there are certain things. You can beat your head against the wall for 20 years trying to do something that, or be angry about something that you have no control over, and kind of letting that go as much as possible, I think, lets you have a much less stressful life, and you can kind of go along with the flow of life. Like when the acting thing hit a wall for me, I didn't quit the business. I started writing, so it's kind of going with that flow and seeing what life brings your way, being open to that.
Jeffrey, I really appreciate you being on the show. Thank you so much. I want to congratulate you on making the jump from screenwriter to writer-director, and in finally getting, I know that's a big step. It is a big step. It's not done very often. It's definitely not done well very often. So I congratulate you, and thank you for bringing Final Destination into our world, into the zeitgeist. It is still very entertaining when I go back and watch those films. So thank you so much for everything you do, my friend, and continued success.
Thank you for all your support, and I just, now you got me all like blushy. Yeah, I do. I appreciate the support. You've been a great supporter for so long. So.